"You're just staff," Ethan Caldwell said, his voice low and effortless, like the kind of truth he believed didn't need to be questioned. And for a moment the entire room seemed to agree with him as the soft clink of crystal glasses faded into a strange, suspended silence under the amber glow of the rooftop restaurant, 30 floors above the city where deals were made and people like Naomi Brooks were never supposed to matter. Moving quietly between tables in pressed black and white, her posture straight, her steps measured, invisible by design, until now. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, neon bleeding into the night. But inside, the air felt tighter, heavier, as if something unseen had just shifted, and Naomi didn't lower her gaze the way most would, didn't rush to apologize or shrink into the role he had assigned her. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, as if she had heard those words before and filed them away somewhere useful, while Ethan leaned back in his chair, tailored suit sharp against the dim light, fingers resting lazily on the table like a man accustomed to control, to being obeyed without question, the kind of man who signed deals worth hundreds of millions without ever second-guessing the room or the people in it, especially not someone carrying a tray. A few guests exchanged quick glances, polite smiles frozen halfway across their faces, unsure whether to laugh or look away, because moments like this weren't supposed to linger, they were supposed to pass, brushed off like a minor inconvenience. But something about Naomi's stillness made it linger, made it uncomfortable, made it real. She reached forward slowly, adjusting a misplaced wine glass with precise, careful fingers, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if the world around her hadn't just tried to reduce her to a single word: staff, background, replaceable. And then, almost too quietly to notice, she spoke. "Are you sure? You want me to stay silent?" The question hung there, thin but sharp, cutting through the low hum of conversation that had started to creep back in. And for the first time that night, Ethan's eyes shifted, not fully, not yet, but just enough to acknowledge something different, something he hadn't accounted for, though he masked it quickly with a faint smirk, dismissive, practiced, the kind that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations across the country, because to him this was still simple, a minor disruption, nothing more. And yet Naomi's gaze didn't waver, her hands returning to her side as she stood there, composed, grounded in a way that didn't match the role he had assigned her, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of the evening, beneath the expensive bourbon and quiet ambition, a subtle tension began to build, almost imperceptible, like the moment before a storm breaks, when everything looks exactly the same, but nothing feels the same anymore. Because what Ethan Caldwell didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that Naomi Brooks had already seen rooms like this, had already watched men like him underestimate the wrong person at the wrong time. And tonight, she wasn't just serving dinner. She was holding something far more valuable than anything on that table, something invisible, something powerful, something that, if spoken aloud, wouldn't just interrupt the evening, it would change it entirely, and she knew it. Even if he didn't, not yet. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the room itself was deciding which side it wanted to be on, and Naomi could feel every pair of eyes that had once ignored her now trying to understand her, measure her, place her somewhere new, while Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, the hint of a laugh following as he leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping once against the polished wood, controlled, deliberate, the gesture of a man reminding himself that he still owned the moment. "You are here to serve, not to speak," he said, softer this time, but sharper, like a line drawn in the sand that he expected her to see and never cross. And a few guests nodded faintly, relieved to return to something familiar, something safe. But Naomi did not move, not away, not back into the shadows. Instead, she reached for the leather folder resting near the center of the table, the one no one had allowed her to touch before, her fingertips brushing the edge as if she already knew what it contained. And that single motion pulled the attention of the entire table back to her, because it was subtle, almost nothing, yet completely out of place. Ethan's eyes narrowed just enough to notice, not anger, not yet, but curiosity mixed with irritation, the kind that comes when something small refuses to stay small. "Careful," he said, a warning dressed as politeness. but Naomi had already opened the folder. Halfway, just enough for the numbers and signatures to catch the light. And for a brief second her expression shifted, not surprised, not confused, but certain, as if she had just confirmed something she had suspected long before she stepped into this room. And when she looked back up at him, there was no challenge in her face, only quiet clarity, the kind that does not ask for permission. "This projection is off by $8.2 million, she said, her voice even, calm, not raised. Not dramatic, just precise, and the words landed differently than anything else that had been said that night. Not loud, but heavy, like a weight placed carefully in the center of the table. A fork slipped from someone's hand, the soft metallic sound louder than it should have been, and suddenly the room that had once dismissed her was listening, truly listening. While Ethan's smile did not disappear, but it tightened, just slightly, as if he was deciding whether to treat this as a mistake or a problem. "That is not your concern," he replied, his tone measured, but there was a pause before it, a fraction of a second that had not been there before, and Naomi noticed it, because she noticed everything. The hesitation, the shift in posture, the way one of the executives beside him leaned forward to glance at the page she had opened, curiosity breaking through his restraint, and for the first time that night, the control Ethan carried so effortlessly began to feel less absolute, less certain, even if only by a degree. And Naomi did not press harder. She did not rush to prove anything. She simply closed the folder gently and stepped back into her place, as if returning to the role he had given her. But the room did not return with her. It stayed suspended in that moment, caught between what it had believed and what it had just witnessed, because something had changed, small but undeniable, and Naomi knew it. Even as she lowered her hands and turned slightly to continue her work, because sometimes power does not announce itself, it reveals itself, one detail at a time, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. No one spoke for a few seconds after she stepped back, but the room was no longer the same room it had been before she touched that folder, the low hum of conversation returning in fragments, quieter now, more cautious, as if every word needed permission before being spoken, and Ethan could feel it, that subtle shift, the way attention no longer moved only toward him but flickered, briefly and repeatedly, toward her. And he did not like it, not because of what she said, but because of what it suggested, because certainty was the currency he traded in, and she had just introduced doubt into a room that was built on confidence. He reached for the folder himself this time, opening it fully, scanning the numbers with a precision that came from years of experience, his expression composed, controlled, but his eyes moved faster than before, sharper, checking, recalculating. And across the table one of his senior partners leaned in, unable to ignore it anymore, adjusting his glasses as he quietly followed the same line Naomi had pointed to without pointing. And then another leaned closer, and another, like gravity had shifted just enough to pull them in. And the air grew heavier, not with tension alone, but with awareness, the kind that spread slowly and then all at once. Ethan flipped a page, then another, his jaw tightening just slightly as the numbers refused to align the way they should have. The kind of miscalculation that did not scream error, but whispered it, subtle, dangerous, easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. And for the first time that night, he did not speak immediately. He paused, just long enough for the silence to notice. And that pause said more than any response could have. Naomi continued moving through the room, refilling a glass here, clearing a plate there, her presence quiet again, almost invisible. But now it was a different kind of invisibility, not ignored, but observed, as if the room had learned something about her and could not forget it, even if it tried. And as she passed behind Ethan's chair, he spoke again, not loudly, not for the room, but just enough for her to hear. "Where did you learn that?" The question simple, direct, stripped of its earlier dismissal, and Naomi did not stop walking, did not turn fully toward him. She simply answered as she reached the next table. "The same place you missed it." Her tone even, not mocking, not proud, just factual, and that answer lingered far longer than the question. A quiet ripple moved through the guests, not laughter, not disbelief, something closer to recognition, because they could feel it now, the shift in balance, slight, but undeniable, like the first tilt of a scale that had always leaned one way. And Ethan felt it too, the loss. Not of control, not yet, but of certainty. And in rooms like this, certainty was everything. He closed the folder slowly, his fingers resting on the cover for a moment as he looked across the table, then past it, toward the city lights beyond the glass, thinking, calculating, adjusting, because whatever this was, whatever she knew, it was no longer something he could dismiss. And for Naomi, that was enough. Not a victory, not yet, but the beginning of one, because she understood something he was only just starting to learn, that power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner, waiting for the right moment to be seen, and once it is, the room can never go back to what it was before. The city lights outside shimmered against the glass like nothing had changed, but inside the room, everything had, even if no one said it out loud. Even if the music still played softly in the background, and the servers continued moving as if the rhythm of the night had not been interrupted, because the truth was quieter than that. It did not need to announce itself. It simply settled into the space and waited. Ethan remained seated, his posture still composed, but there was a new stillness to him, not the confident ease from before, but something more calculated, more alert, as if he was now measuring every word, every movement, every silence. And across the table his partners were no longer leaning back comfortably. They were leaning forward, engaged in a way they had not been moments ago, flipping pages, whispering to one another, checking numbers that had once been accepted without question. And it was not the mistake itself that unsettled them. It was the realization that it had almost gone unnoticed, that it had taken someone they had not even considered to bring it into focus. Naomi moved toward the service station near the edge of the room, placing a tray down with steady hands, her breathing even, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflected something deeper, not triumph, not defiance, but clarity. The kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand in a moment that is shifting beneath everyone else. And as she reached for a clean glass, one of the junior analysts from Ethan's team approached her, hesitant at first, then more certain, drawn by something he could not ignore. "Excuse me," he said quietly, careful not to draw too much attention. "What exactly did you see?" And Naomi paused for just a second before answering, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of the question. "The forecast assumes a growth rate that does not match the supplier constraints listed in the appendix," she said. Simple, direct, and the analyst's expression shifted instantly, recognition, then concern, as if a missing piece had just been placed where it belonged. And he turned quickly, heading back toward the table with a new urgency, leaving Naomi exactly where she had been, yet no longer the same in the eyes of anyone who had heard her. At the center of it all, Ethan closed the folder again, this time more deliberately, his gaze lifting not toward the skyline, not toward his partners, but toward Naomi, across the room. And for a moment he did not speak. He simply watched, observing her the way one studies a variable that does not fit into an expected equation. And when he finally stood, the movement was smooth, controlled, but it carried a different energy than before, less command, more intention, as if he was stepping into a situation he no longer fully understood but could not afford to ignore. And as he walked across the floor toward her, the conversations around him softened again, not because he demanded it, but because everyone sensed something unfolding, something that had not been part of the plan. Naomi looked up as he approached, not startled, not defensive, simply aware, and when he stopped a few feet away, there was no distance left for assumptions, only the truth of the moment standing between them. And Ethan spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it once carried. "That kind of detail does not come from nowhere," he said, not a question, not yet, more like a realization forming as he said it aloud. And Naomi held his gaze without hesitation, without apology, because this was the moment where the roles they had both been given began to blur, where the lines that had once seemed so clear started to shift, and she understood something he was only beginning to see, that the person he had dismissed was no longer standing in the background, and the room that had once belonged entirely to him was no longer fully his to control. For a moment neither of them moved, the distance between them filled with something far more complex than silence, something that carried weight, history, and a shift neither could fully undo. And Naomi did not rush to explain herself, did not step forward to justify what she knew. She simply stood there with the same quiet composure that had followed her all night, while Ethan studied her more closely now, not as staff, not as background, but as a variable he had failed to calculate, and that realization sat heavier than he expected. Around them, the room had subtly reorganized itself, conversations reduced to murmurs, eyes drifting back again and again to where they stood, because people understood instinctively when something rare was unfolding, something that did not fit the script of wealth and hierarchy they had all come to rely on. And one of Ethan's partners cleared his throat at the table, calling out just enough to pull his attention back. "Ethan, you might want to look at this again," his tone careful, not challenging, but no longer certain either, and Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze still fixed on Naomi as if the answer he needed was standing right in front of him rather than inside the folder he had just closed. "You saw more than just a number," he said finally, quieter now, not accusing, but searching. And Naomi let a brief pause settle before answering, not for effect, but because she understood timing in a way that could not be taught. "Numbers tell stories," she said, her voice steady, "but only if you know what questions to ask." And that answer did not sound like something learned casually. It sounded practiced, earned, and it lingered long enough for Ethan to feel the edges of it pressing against his assumptions. He exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the table where his team now hovered over the documents with a level of attention they had not shown before. Recalculating, cross-checking, and the confidence that had once filled the room now felt thinner, more fragile, as if it had been built on something that was never fully solid to begin with. And when he looked back at Naomi, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal left in his expression, only a growing awareness that he had underestimated not just her, but the situation itself. Naomi reached for another glass, placing it carefully on her tray, her movements still precise, still controlled, as if nothing about her role had changed, and in a way, it had not. She was still serving, still moving through the room, but the meaning behind it had shifted entirely, because now every step she took carried a different kind of presence, one that did not ask to be seen, but could not be ignored anymore. And Ethan noticed it, the way others noticed it. The subtle difference between someone who performs a role and someone who understands the room better than anyone inside it. "Where did you work before this?" he asked, the question direct now, stripped of any attempt to hide his interest, and Naomi's eyes met his again, calm, unwavering. "In rooms like this," she replied, simple, unembellished. And that answer landed harder than any explanation could have, because it did not need details to be understood. It carried its own weight, its own implication, and for a brief second, Ethan said nothing, not because he had no response, but because he was recalibrating, adjusting to a version of reality that no longer fit his expectations. And somewhere in that moment, the balance between them shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to be felt, enough to change the direction of everything that would follow. The distance between them no longer felt defined by status or role, but by something far more fragile, understanding, and Ethan could feel it settling in, unfamiliar and unwelcome, as he stood there facing Naomi with a question he had not expected to ask and an answer he was not entirely prepared to hear. While behind him the quiet urgency at the table grew stronger, pages shifting, low voices rising just enough to signal that the issue she had pointed out was not disappearing, it was expanding, unfolding into something larger than a simple miscalculation. And one of his partners finally stood, walking toward them with the folder in hand, his usual confidence replaced by a measured concern. "Ethan, this is not just a projection issue," he said carefully, glancing briefly at Naomi before returning his focus to Ethan. "The supply chain assumptions do not align with the contracts we signed last quarter." And that sentence carried weight, not dramatic, but precise, the kind of detail that could ripple outward into consequences far beyond the room. Ethan took the folder again, this time without hesitation, flipping to the appendix, scanning the clauses that had once seemed routine, and the more he read, the clearer it became that Naomi had not simply noticed an error. She had uncovered a structural flaw, something that could compromise the entire deal if left unchecked, and the realization did not come as a shock, but as a slow tightening in his chest, the kind that comes when Control begins to slip in ways you cannot immediately correct. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly against the tray, her posture unchanged, but her attention fully present, not on the reaction, not on the tension building around her, but on the truth of what had already been revealed, because for her, this moment was not about proving anything. It was about allowing what was already there to be seen. Ethan closed the folder again, more firmly this time, and looked at her, really looked at her, not as a server, not as a passing interruption, but as someone who had shifted the trajectory of the evening with a single observation. And when he spoke, again, there was no edge left in his voice, only clarity. If you noticed that, then you understand what it means, and it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement, the first one he had offered her all night. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, grounded. "It means the timeline is unrealistic," she said, her voice even. "And if you push forward without adjusting, the cost will not just be financial." And she let the rest of the implications settle without finishing it, because she did not need to. The room understood, Ethan understood, and that was enough. A quiet silence followed, not the tense kind from before, but something more focused, more intentional, as if the room had shifted from performance to reality, from assumption to awareness, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, processing, recalibrating, the weight of the decision now resting clearly in front of him, no longer hidden behind confidence or momentum. Around them, the energy continued to change, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that does not reverse easily. Because once truth enters a room like this, it does not leave quietly. It reshapes everything, and Naomi knew that, even as she lifted her tray again, ready to continue her work, because for her, this was never about stepping into the spotlight. It was about understanding when the moment demanded clarity, and having the courage to let it speak, even when no one expected it to come from her. The room no longer felt like a stage for performance. It felt like a place where something real had taken hold, and Ethan could sense that every second he delayed would only deepen the shift that had already begun. So he turned back toward the table, his movements steady but more deliberate now, the kind of precision that comes not from confidence alone but from awareness. And as he approached, the conversations around him quieted once more, not out of habit this time, but out of expectation, because everyone understood that whatever he said next would define the direction of the night. He placed the folder down in front of him and did not sit immediately, his hand resting lightly against the edge as he looked at each person seated there, measuring not just their reactions but their readiness. And then he spoke, his voice calm, controlled, but stripped of the earlier certainty. "We are pausing this deal," he said, and the words landed with a weight that no one could ignore, not loud, not dramatic, but final enough to change everything in the room. A ripple moved through the table, subtle but unmistakable, chairs shifting, eyes widening slightly, not in panic, but in recognition of what that decision meant. The time, the money, the momentum all brought to a sudden halt, and one of the executives opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, because the truth had already been exposed, and arguing against it would only reveal more weakness. Ethan finally took his seat, but the position felt different now, less like a throne and more like a responsibility he had to carry with clarity, and he opened the folder again, not to defend it, but to understand it, turning pages with a focus that was sharper, more grounded. While across the room Naomi continued her work, her presence quiet, almost distant again, but the room had not forgotten her. It could not. And even those who tried to return to their conversations found themselves distracted, pulled back toward the shift she had created. A few minutes passed in this new rhythm, slower, more intentional, until Ethan closed the folder once more and stood again, this time without hesitation, walking directly toward Naomi with a purpose that did not need to be announced. And as he stopped in front of her, the distance between them felt different than before, not defined by hierarchy, but by recognition. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something rare. "You saw what we missed," he said, not as praise, not as apology, but as a simple acknowledgement of fact. And Naomi met his gaze calmly, her expression unchanged, because for her, this was never about being seen. It was about being understood. It was always there, she replied, her tone even. You just had to look past what you expected to find. And that answer settled between them. Not challenging, not defensive, but clear, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, the gesture. Small, but meaningful, because it marked a shift he could not undo. The moment he chose to listen instead of dismiss, to question instead of assume. Around them, the room watched quietly, aware that something more than a business decision had taken place, something deeper, something that did not show up in contracts or projections but changed the way power moved through a space. And Naomi, still holding her tray, still standing in the same uniform she had worn all night, no longer felt like part of the background, because the truth she carried had already rewritten her place in the room, and whether anyone admitted it or not, nothing about the night could return to what it had been before. The acknowledgement did not fade when the words ended. It stayed in the air, quiet but undeniable, and Naomi felt it the way you feel a shift in temperature, subtle but real, something you cannot ignore once it happens. And for the first time that night, the weight she carried was no longer hers alone. It had spread across the room, into the table, into the minds of people who had spent their entire careers believing they could not miss something this important. And yet they had. Ethan stepped back slightly, not retreating, but creating space, as if he understood that this moment did not belong entirely to him anymore. And the room followed his lead in a way they had not done before, not out of habit, but out of recognition, because leadership had just taken on a different shape, one that required listening as much as speaking. Naomi turned to place a glass down on a nearby table, her movements still measured, still precise, but there was a quiet shift in how she carried herself now. Not louder, not more assertive, just grounded in a way that came from being seen without needing to demand it. And as she stepped away, one of the senior investors rose from his seat, adjusting his jacket as he approached her with a careful curiosity, the kind that replaces assumption when it no longer feels safe to assume. You mentioned supplier constraints, he said, his tone respectful, almost cautious. What exactly are we overlooking? And Naomi paused, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that every word now carried more weight than before. She set the tray down gently and faced him, her voice steady, clear. The contracts limit volume expansion for the next 18 months, she said. But the forecast pushes growth within 12, which means the numbers rely on capacity that does not exist yet. And the simplicity of her explanation made it land harder, because it removed any space for confusion, leaving only the truth of the misalignment. The investor nodded. Slowly, the realization settling in, and he glanced back toward the table where others were already rechecking the same section, the quiet urgency now fully visible, no longer hidden behind confidence or routine. Across the room, Ethan watched this unfold, his expression thoughtful, no longer defensive, because the situation had moved beyond ego, beyond pride, into something more fundamental. And he could feel it reshaping not just the deal, but the way the room functioned, the way authority moved, the way voices were heard. He stepped forward again, joining the small circle that had formed around Naomi, not as the center of it, but as part of it. And when he spoke, it was not to correct or control, but to understand. If the timeline shifts, he said, his voice measured, what does that do to the margin projections? And the question itself marked a change, because it acknowledged her role in the conversation without hesitation. Naomi met his gaze briefly before answering, her tone even. It compresses them in the short term, she said, but it stabilizes them long term if you adjust the rollout instead of forcing it. And again, the clarity in her response cut through the noise, giving direction where there had been uncertainty. A quiet stillness followed, not empty, but focused, the kind that comes when people are no longer trying to prove themselves, but to understand something bigger than themselves. And Naomi reached for her tray again, lifting it with steady hands, ready to continue moving through the room, because for her, the work had not changed, only the meaning behind it had. And as she stepped away, the room did not return to what it had been. It moved forward, reshaped by a truth that had come from the one person no one had expected to hear. The rhythm of the room had changed completely now, no longer driven by polished presentations or rehearsed confidence, but by something more deliberate, more grounded, and Naomi could feel it even as she moved between tables, her steps quiet, her presence steady, yet no longer unnoticed, because every glance that followed her now carried a different kind of awareness, not curiosity alone, but respect that had not been there before. At the center of the room, the table that once operated like a well-oiled machine had slowed, not in dysfunction, but in recalibration. Pages spread wider, voices lower but sharper, each detail examined with a care that had been missing just an hour ago, and Ethan stood among them, not above them. His posture still strong, but his attention distributed differently, no longer commanding every movement, but guiding it, adjusting to a role that required him to listen as much as lead. One of the senior partners leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he set his pen down. "If we had signed tonight," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough for those nearby to hear, "we would have locked ourselves into a timeline we cannot meet." And the statement did not sound dramatic. It sounded factual, which made it heavier, more real, because it was no longer a possibility. It was a near certainty they had just avoided. Ethan nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly across the room until it landed again on Naomi, who was placing a tray down near the service station, her movements unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet everything had, and he could not ignore the contrast between her quiet composure and the magnitude of what she had uncovered. He stepped away from the table again, not rushed, not uncertain, but with a clarity that had taken shape over the last several minutes. And as he approached her once more, the room did not fall silent this time. It simply softened, like a background adjusting itself to allow something more important to be heard. "You did not have to say anything," he said when he reached her, his voice calm, stripped of any trace of earlier distance. Most people would not have. And Naomi looked at him, her expression steady, her tone unchanged. "Most people are not listening," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it revealed something deeper than skill or knowledge. It revealed intention, awareness, the decision to see what others overlook. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, not searching now, but recognizing, and in that moment, something settled between them, not equal in position, but closer in understanding than they had been before, and he gave a slight nod, not formal, not performative, just genuine, the kind that acknowledges something that cannot be undone. Behind him, the table continued its work, more focused now, more precise, each voice contributing not to impress, but to correct, to rebuild something stronger than what had been presented. And the energy in the room no longer felt like competition, it felt like alignment, fragile but real. Naomi lifted her tray again, stepping back in emotion, into the role she had carried all night. But the meaning behind it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, because the room had seen her, not just as someone who served, but as someone who understood, and once that understanding exists, it does not disappear, it stays, shaping every glance, every decision, every moment that follows, long after the night itself is over. The night continued, but it no longer felt like the same night, the kind that follows a script written long before anyone arrives. Instead, it moved with intention, shaped moment by moment by people who were now paying closer attention than they had when they first sat down. And Ethan could feel that shift settling deeper, not just in the room, but within himself, as he returned to the table and took his seat again, not with the certainty he had carried earlier, but with something more grounded, more aware, the kind of clarity that does not come from control, but from understanding what you almost missed. The folder lay open in front of him once more, but this time it was not a tool to close a deal. It was something to be questioned, examined, challenged, and he ran his fingers along the edge of the page Naomi had first noticed, pausing there for a moment as if marking the exact point where everything had changed. And across from him, his partners were no longer waiting for direction. They were contributing, offering recalculations, suggesting adjustments, not to impress, but to correct, to rebuild something that could actually hold under pressure instead of collapse beneath it. One of the analysts leaned forward, tapping lightly on the document. "If we extend the rollout by 6 months and renegotiate supplier volume caps, we can stabilize the projections," he said, his tone measured, cautious but hopeful, and Ethan nodded slowly, considering it, not dismissing it, not rushing past it, because every decision now carried a different weight, one shaped by the awareness that had been missing before. Across the room, Naomi moved through the tables once more, clearing glasses, adjusting settings, her presence steady, consistent, as if she had stepped back into the rhythm she had always known. But the room did not see her the same way anymore, could not see her the same way, because the quiet truth she had revealed had already taken root, and even those who tried to return to their conversations found themselves watching her with a kind of respect that did not need to be spoken. Ethan looked up again, his eyes finding her almost instinctively now, and for a moment he simply observed, not analyzing, not questioning, just acknowledging, the way one does when something has fundamentally shifted beyond words. And then he stood once more, not abruptly, not to command attention, but with a purpose that felt quieter, more personal, and he walked toward her again, stopping at a respectful distance this time, not closing the space as he had before, as if he understood that some distance needed to be earned, not assumed. "We are restructuring the deal," he said, his voice calm, steady, not seeking approval, but sharing a decision shaped by what she had uncovered. And Naomi gave a small nod, not as validation, but as recognition, because she already knew what that decision meant, the time it would take, the conversations that would follow, the complexity that would unfold. And yet her expression did not change, still grounded, still composed, as if the outcome had never been the point. Ethan hesitated for a brief second, something unspoken lingering just beneath the surface, and then he added, "You saw it before anyone else did." And this time there was no distance in his tone, no hierarchy, just truth. And Naomi met his gaze once more, her voice quiet but clear. "It was never about seeing first," she said. "It was about choosing to say something." And that distinction settled deeply, not just with him, but with the moment itself, because it shifted the focus from ability to courage, from knowledge to action. And as the night moved forward, reshaped and redirected, one thing remained certain: the balance of the room had changed, not because power disappeared, but because it had been forced to listen. And once power listens, it is never quite the same again. The night had settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that no longer rushed toward a conclusion, but moved with intention. Each conversation more deliberate, each decision weighed with a clarity that had not existed before, and Ethan could feel the difference in every exchange at the table. The way his partners now spoke with consideration instead of assumption, the way questions replaced declarations, and as he listened, truly listened, he realized that the most significant shift had not been in the numbers or the projections, but in the way the room now valued attention, the willingness to look deeper instead of faster. He leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as he watched the discussion unfold, not dominating it, not interrupting it, but guiding it when necessary. And that change, subtle but real, did not go unnoticed by those around him, because leadership in that moment was no longer about being the loudest voice. It was about being the most aware. Across the room, Naomi continued her work, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all evening. But now there was a difference in how others responded to her. The small gestures that once went unnoticed, a guest pausing before handing her a glass, another offering a quiet thank you with eye contact that had not existed earlier, and even the staff around her seemed to sense it. The way she had altered the flow of something much larger than a single service shift, though she carried it without change, without seeking acknowledgement, because for her, the work remained the same even if the meaning behind it had grown. As the conversation at the table reached a natural pause, one of the senior investors spoke again, his voice thoughtful, reflective. "We built this model to move fast," he said, glancing briefly toward Ethan before continuing. "But speed does not matter if it is built on something we did not fully understand." And the statement did not challenge, it clarified, it reinforced what had already been revealed, and Ethan nodded once, not as agreement alone, but as acceptance of a lesson that had been learned in real time. He stood once more, not with urgency, but with a quiet resolve, and walked toward Naomi again, the distance between them no longer defined by hierarchy, but by something more balanced, something that had been earned over the course of the evening. And when he stopped in front of her, he did not speak immediately. He allowed the moment to exist as it was, unforced, real, before finally saying, "You changed the direction of this deal." And there was no hesitation in his voice. No attempt to soften or reframe it. Just truth. Naomi looked at him. Her expression steady, her posture unchanged, and for a brief moment it seemed as though she might respond. But instead she simply nodded once, not dismissive, not proud, just acknowledging what had already been said, because for her, the significance of the moment did not need to be expanded. It already existed. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer before giving a slight nod in return, a gesture that carried more weight than any formal recognition could have. And as he turned back toward the table, the room felt different once again, not because something new had happened, but because what had already happened had been fully understood, and in that understanding, the balance of the night settled into something more stable, more honest, something that would not easily be undone, long after the lights dimmed and the conversations ended. The evening began to wind down, but it did not fade in the usual way. There was no return to shallow conversation or effortless confidence. Instead, the room held on to something quieter, something that lingered beneath every exchange, as if each person present understood that they had witnessed a moment that would not repeat itself in quite the same way again, and Ethan could feel it most of all, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that settles after a storm you did not realize was coming. Until it had already passed, the table was no longer filled with urgency, but with intention, the revised plans taking shape carefully, each adjustment grounded in reality rather than assumption. And as the final notes were made and the documents closed, there was no sense of loss in the delay, only a quiet recognition that what had been prevented mattered far more than what had been postponed. Ethan stood once more, not to lead, not to direct, but simply to step away from the table, his gaze moving across the room until it found Naomi again, still moving through her responsibilities with the same steady rhythm, as if the entire evening had not shifted because of her, and yet everything had. And he walked toward her one last time, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with something closer to respect than anything he had carried earlier. When he reached her, he did not interrupt her movement immediately. He waited until she placed a glass down and turned slightly, acknowledging his presence without surprise, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be proven, only something to be recognized. "I was wrong," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet, not performative, not designed for the room, but for the truth of the moment itself, and the words did not carry apology in the usual sense. They carried awareness, a shift that could not be undone, and Naomi looked at him, her expression calm, unchanged, as if she had never expected anything different. And in that calm, there was no triumph, no validation, only a steady presence that had been there from the beginning. "It is not about being right," she replied, her tone even, measured. "It is about what you do once you know." And the simplicity of her words settled deeper than anything else that had been said that night, because it removed the focus from ego and placed it entirely on responsibility, on action, on the choice that follows awareness. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting it, because he understood now that the moment had never been about losing control. It had been about gaining perspective, and as he stepped back, the distance between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like something balanced, something understood. Around them, the room had softened, conversations returning, but with a different tone, less about impression and more about reflection. And as guests began to gather their things, to prepare to leave, there was an unspoken awareness that the evening had not been defined by the deal that almost happened, but by the truth that had stopped it. Naomi lifted her tray once more, continuing her work without pause, without change, because for her, this was not the end of anything. It was simply another moment where she had chosen to speak when it mattered, and as she moved through the room, unnoticed once again by some, acknowledged quietly by others, the impact of what she had done remained, not in the noise of the night, but in the decisions that would follow long after it was over. The last guests began to leave, one table at a time, their voices softer now, their steps slower, as if the night had given them something heavier than they expected to carry, and the rooftop that once felt like a stage for power now felt like a place where something quieter had taken root, something that did not need to be announced to be understood. The city still stretched endlessly beyond the glass, lights blinking, traffic moving, the world continuing without pause. But inside, the energy had changed in a way that could not be reversed, and Ethan stood near the edge of the room, his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching as the final pieces of the evening settled into place, not with urgency, not with control, but with a kind of stillness he had not known before. Across the room, Naomi moved through the last of her responsibilities, stacking glasses, clearing tables, her motions consistent, grounded, as if nothing about her had shifted, and in many ways it had not, because the strength she carried had never been new, it had only been unseen. Ethan took a slow breath and walked toward her once more, not out of necessity, not because something needed to be fixed, but because there was one thing left unspoken, something that did not belong to the deal or the numbers, but to the moment itself. And when he reached her, he stopped, not too close, not too distant, just enough to be present without assuming space. Naomi looked up briefly, acknowledging him with the same calm awareness she had shown all night, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the weight of what had happened did not require explanation. It already existed between them. "What happens next?" Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but reflective. "Will be different because of you." And the words were not a promise, not a gesture, but a recognition of consequence, the kind that extends beyond a single evening. And Naomi considered it for a brief second before responding, her tone unchanged, grounded in the same clarity that had guided her from the beginning. "Then make sure it stays that way," she said, not as instruction, not as challenge, but as truth, simple and direct. And Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that what she was asking did not end with the decision he had already made. It continued with every decision that would follow. A quiet silence settled once more, but this time it was not uncertain. It was complete, the kind that comes when nothing more needs to be added. And Ethan gave a small nod before stepping back, allowing the moment to close without forcing it further. And as he turned toward the exit, the room no longer felt like something he owned. It felt like something he had learned from. Naomi returned to her work without pause, lifting the final tray, moving toward the service station, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of the space. But the meaning behind it had shifted permanently, because she had never needed to be loud to be powerful. She had never needed to take control to change it. She had simply chosen the moment to speak, and that choice had done what power alone could not. The lights dimmed slightly as the staff began to reset the room for the next day. Chairs aligned, surfaces cleared, everything returning to order on the surface. But beneath it, something remained, something that would carry forward long after the tables were filled again, because the truth had been spoken, and once truth enters a room, it does not leave. It stays in the way people listen, in the way they question, in the way they choose to see what they once ignored. He had the power to command the room, to shape outcomes, to move decisions with a single word. But that night, she had something greater, something quieter, something that did not need permission. She had the courage to reveal what others overlooked. And in doing so, she did not just change the deal, she changed the way power itself had to respond. And in the end, she did not raise her voice, she did not demand to be seen. She simply told the truth, and the truth changed everything.